Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. Also, don't forget to check out my Substack. Today is Casual Stream episode 102, what a new class might look like. I've already begun exploring this idea in a roundtable about a month or so ago, but I feel like there's more to say. And there's a lot more to unpack. And this can also be tied into broader themes that I've had about a spiritual science that I believe not only once existed, but is developing again. And my past couple streams on Tuesdays about power. So without further ado, we shall begin tonight's reading. Are the conditions for a new class developing? In the 17th and 18th centuries, the new ruling class, the bourgeoisie, asserted control over the Western European countries of Holland, Britain, the US, and France. The powers of Europe at this time were ruled by ancient aristocratic families that arose out of the ashes of the Western Roman Empire, along with support from the state church, either the Roman Catholic, Lutheran, or Anglican variety. These aristocratic families maintained their class dominance by military force, dispersed private property, castles, feudal ties, and religiously sanctioned oaths. Born out of the chieftains and their housecarls who sacked and pillaged the Western Roman Empire, these nobles were rewarded with land taken in conquest as payment for their services. A good example of this is how William the Conqueror divided up Saxon lands in England and gave them to his loyalists. The basis for securing this power base were castles. Castles not only protected fiefdoms from local uprisings or external conquest, but also from the central state under the dominant royal house. Being a semi-professional military caste, these men dominated the peasants around them. Their bonds of fealty and trust were guaranteed by oaths sanctioned by the church. These men actively resisted the centralization of power in the hands of what would become the state, as this directly threatened their power base. This can be seen in the Barons' War and the Magna Carta of 1215, securing the rights of the nobles. With the advent of gunpowder and the commercial revolution in the late Middle Ages, the seeds for the bourgeoisie were laid. Uniting the barons and the dukes into a single state could be done either by conquest or bribery. What was needed to achieve victory in conquest, as was achieved in France in the 17th century with Louis XIV in the Fronde Wars, offensive power and finance, which were united in the standing army of France that began to exist in the 100 Years' War. Gunpowder in the form of cannons could reduce castles to rubble, and financing methods allowed for long-term military deployments, which allowed for the state to consolidate power over feudal lords. As in the case of the Feldarian colony in Panama, an early example of a financial bubble, the Union of Great Britain was formed in 1707 by offering the Scottish nobles debt forgiveness if they allowed for a permanent union with England. The mechanism for the rise of the bourgeoisie was the cash nexus. The universal application of cash exchange is the universal social medium between man and man. Ties of family, religion, ethnicity, and culture were to all be severed and replaced by cash exchange. The rise of the bourgeoisie coincided with the rise in state power. The state became a willing accomplice to the bourgeoisie, and that through financing and commercial exchange, they could mobilize large armies and secure forces to control people and extend their power. Through commercial ventures to the New World in Asia, they could not only challenge but break the economic monopoly the Islamic world had on Eurasia via the Silk Road. The bourgeoisie gained by having the state present to subsidize the costs of protecting their capital stock via the police, limiting competition by legal means such as intellectual property, and publicly funded research into technologies that could not be sustained on a for-profit basis in the development stage. Initially, it was thought it was through the bourgeoisie states' superior leadership skills and financing abilities that crushed reactionary military forces and expanded the domain of commerce. The latent democratic and populist themes in not only the Anglosphere and Dutch colonies and territories, but also France, Germany, and Scandinavia, allowed for the rise of the meritocratic officer class that led armies based on performance rather than merely class privilege, and the common fighting man was highly motivated to perform well in battle with the hope of reward. This professional military reached its full expression with the French Revolution and Napoleon, where all of the reactionary states of Europe's militaries were swept away. This military pressure forced the reactionary state to adopt French levels of professionalism in order to survive, thereby weakening royal power. A reactionary state cannot partially absorb bourgeois values without either being corrupted by them or crushing these forces, leaving them militarily vulnerable to external threats that do not do this. The next major power projection factor that the bourgeoisie gave to the state was technological innovation. With each cumulative weapons development that occurred, the state had a competitive advantage against those states that did not. This was driven by two major factors, war and economic growth. Most technological innovation occurs during war. This is because the competing factions are always seeking to gain an edge over each other. If war can also be turned into a for-profit enterprise, as we see beginning in the 15th century in Liege, then profit comes at both ends. Profit comes from the arming and equipping of armies and the post-war commercial use of technological developments. The second factor is economic growth, as the energy necessary for continued investment by the state in such technologies is not suitable on a for-profit basis if one is seeking to make a quantum leap in technology, say from no guns to guns. This leads to the debt-based economy in which the loans are issued to capitalize projects that cannot currently be funded with the amount of money in circulation, with the expectation that future economic growth will cover the cost of the loans, which is itself a built-in feedback loop for technological development. The best introduction to how the system of bourgeois society works is Frederick C. Howell's Confessions of a Monopolist, which I've discussed at length elsewhere. The basics are this. The skeleton of the bourgeoisie is the infrastructure of capital, resource extraction, transportation, production, and communication. Step 1 would be mines and lumber yards. Step 2 would be waterways, roads, and railroads. Step 3 would be factories. And step 4 would be telegraph wires, radios, and the internet. The cost of maintaining this interconnected system is externalized to the people via taxes used to support the police force, who protects property. Intellectual property turns non-physical, non-scarce, and non-fungible assets into a, quote, form, unquote, of property through the use of force. The way the mechanisms interact is the complex interaction of moving parts, both mechanical and human, through a process of efficiency, which Ellul calls technique. In order to hide this reality, which is stark, ugly, and soul-crushing, the bourgeois society is in league with the security state in the U.S. formulated the culture war, a frozen conflict of countergangs, in which the people's surplus energy and desire to resist and strike out is directed horizontally against each other rather than vertically against the system itself. One could argue that between the 17th and 21st centuries, a new class has already arisen in a power-sharing arrangement with the bourgeoisie, the technocrats. The dynamic boom and bust cycle of the market economy is too volatile for the preservation of what Thorsten Veblen calls the machine process, which needs an orderly and controlled environment that is resistant to uncontrolled dynamic changes. As technology grows and through the creative destruction of Schumpeter tears up older modes of production and replaces them with newer in a push-pull dynamic with capital, we see that with each new level of capitalization and technology, fewer and fewer people are needed in order to do real work. Most of the excess population is employed in make-work projects, which leads to bureaucratic bloat. This class, generally speaking, is not in conflict with the bourgeoisie, as it still needs to be capitalized. And in the 21st century U.S. economy of intense financialization, it seems that the technocrats do not intend to directly challenge the bourgeoisie. Partly this is the result of the failure of the two non-market technocratic alternatives of the 20th century, National Socialist Germany and Marxist Soviet Union, failing to be viable alternatives to the Anglosphere bourgeois model. What reasons do we have to think that this order is faltering? Many. Firstly, through the work of Joseph Tainter and John Michael Greer, the evidence is shaping up that we are reaching EROI limits for coal, oil, and natural gas. As human innovation is not exempt from the law of diminishing returns, we cannot innovate indefinitely. Otherwise, why didn't Rome, China, or Babylon innovate at other crises? From all of recorded human history until the 18th century, wood was the primary source of energy for human consumption. We then had the first major energy shift in human history, the wood-coal point. We then had a second major shift, the coal-oil point. The third jump was projected, the oil-nuclear point. That the oil-nuclear point has not been crossed and increasingly looks like it will not be crossed, which shows us that the assumptions of jumping from energy transition to energy transition is premature. If we assume that history is the guide for future human activity, then rapid short-term shifts in energy sources are the anomaly. It is unwise to assume that this will be enduring and that the thousands of years of energy stasis will not return. The culture war has been too successful for its own good. On the one hand, had the anti-war and pro-labor movement it was meant to derail in the 1960s has been totally defeated in the U.S. Mission accomplished. The problem is twofold. People are taking it too far, and the masses are saying things they shouldn't. A good example of people taking things too far was the woke movement associated with Barack Obama. Combination of progressive ideological propositions ranging from anti-white sentiment masquerading as anti-racism, anti-male sentiment masquerading as female empowerment, transgenderism, and more, coupled with aggressive tactics such as doxing and hiring practices that discriminated against white men. They crippled the U.S. empire's ability to project power. Where an unhinged ideology disconnected from material conditions and historical realities fatally injured the war-making capabilities of the U.S. global empire. Anti-natalist policies dating back to the 1970s have led to a demographic black hole from which the Western world is not likely to recover from, fatally compromising power projection. Innovation and warfighting capabilities are not going to come from women and sexual minorities, but men. These very self-same men that were targeted in order to ensure hegemonic dominance domestically. This has taken things too far. Furthermore, the entrenched political ideologies have become mortal enemies and are willing to act in a chaotic way outside of the script of the culture war that may in fact harm the machinery of power. The lies of the past decade are one by one falling and the truth is rising to the fore. You cannot suppress the truth forever. No amount of force can kill an ideology, as can be seen in the Roman state suppressing Christianity in the 1st century, or the U.S. empire waging war against Islamism in the 21st century. If enough people realize they are being played, they will turn their proverbial guns from each other to the leadership class. This becomes far more likely with the overproduction of elites that has occurred in the last few decades. The logic of capital demanded that the cost of highly trained technicians and managers be reduced. This cost reduction was occurred by flooding universities with students and efforts to prop up women, ethnic minorities, and sexual minorities to dilute the cost of each professional worker. This actually fueled the woke. Clearly, women, ethnic minorities, and sexual minorities were not being hired for the real work of maintaining the skeleton of techno-capital. These groups did not work in mines or high-tech R&D research. My theory is that mostly white men still got hired for these jobs, but at a lower wage rate as they imagined competition from those other sectors drove the costs down. This directly led to the woke, who claimed these people were qualified but being discriminated against. This is what is called blowback, an unintended and harmful reaction from an earlier action deemed to be helpful. This was compounded when under the woke regency, white men were gatekept out of important managerial and hiring positions. We now have many on the far right, far left, and center with expensive degrees who are smart, intelligent, and angry. This is the nuclei for a future revolutionary class. As economic conditions worsen, a logical choice might be some form of socialism or labor organizing. But this is not the class I'm speaking of when I speak of a new class. The key means for maintaining power is gatekeeping through mechanisms such as accreditation, licenses, high monetary cost to entry, and artificial scarcity produced by legal measures, as in the case of IP laws. All are breaking down. In the 19th century, you needed land and money to acquire mines and build factories. This has had a high cost of entry based on money. If you don't have enough dough, you can't play the game. Since the 1980s, we have moved into an information economy where the mind, rather than the body, is the primary generator of value. This means the cost of capitalization is reduced to zero. Anybody can go to a library and read books. Read enough books and you can build a model that revolutionizes the world. Couple that with the fact that if people only knew that they have the Library of Alexandria in the palm of their hands and a smartphone, they could do this as well. We see with social media platforms such as X, people who properly play this game can directly interact with business tycoons, politicians, and religious leaders. A true leveling of the field. No longer is the president of some company inaccessible to the people. You can just @ him on X. Telecommuting, the failure of established centers of education, and much more is generating forces that will merely sidestep the entrenched watchdogs of our current system. A class is a product of its material conditions. The aristocracy was that of a pre-industrial society based on martial prowess. The bourgeoisie society based on the caste nexus, the technocracy rooted in the interaction between industrial processes, and my proposed new class rooted in the social relations around cyberspace. The material conditions for this new class is the internet itself. Using Baudrillard, much of the internet is simulacra and madness-inducing, hence the pending psychological Black Death and the erratic behavior of the woke, which, in part, brought it down, as well as increasingly erratic behavior from normies. This is what Emile Durkheim calls anomie, the sense of purposelessness in life due to the rapid changes in society, usually driven by technological advancement. If the key feature of modern society is alienation, not only from labor, as Marx stated, but also organic human relationships, nature, and God, then the internet is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is hyper-reality on steroids. One can avoid any and all contact with the real world as long as one likes. Paradoxically, it is also the only contact most people have to the real. If we use Nick Land's term, technocapital, as a catch-all term to encapsulate the commercial and industrial revolutions over the last 400 years, then the only way to experience the real is in books, plays, and myths from previous ages. All of modern society is governed by Ellul's technique and Carlyle's caste nexus, effectively cutting people off from real things. The experience of a real thing in, say, a Shakespeare play will of necessity, especially if consumed via the internet, be a highly mediated experience, one rooted in the intellect and will rather than the body and through the senses. Yet this is all that remains and is the single anchor one can use to escape technocapital. Most of humanity will fail the test of the internet and succumb to hyperreality, anomie, and madness. But for a chosen few, the new aristocrats, this will be the formation of a new class in a new world. What are the selection pressures of the material conditions of the internet that will produce this new class? Firstly, highly developed mental functions. As stated earlier, most people will fail the test of hyperreality at your fingertips. But the real that lies locked away in the recesses of cyberspace is where the relics of the past will be found, primarily through the mental processes than physical, as the ways of living and thinking do not exist anymore. The material and social conditions that make them no longer exist. The only way to experience these material and social conditions at all is to use written accounts of said authors. This is naturally attractive to highly intellectual individuals, and unless you are highly intuitive in spiritual sense, in which case you can do this without a super intellect, the poet to the philosopher, most people will fail to develop the inner consciousness necessary to see this reality. It will also take mental and spiritual discipline to avoid the pitfalls of easy access to hyperreality on their smart devices. This will lead to the production of a highly disciplined class of individuals who can use powerful technologies without engaging in moral hazards. This devaluing of physical sensation and experience will lead to a more distant, but also unclouded view of the material world, as if one is looking down from a great height. In short, this is a selection pressure that selects for those who are already have highly developed mental or intuitive functions that arise organically from within the individual with little or no training necessary. The people will have mentat-like powers. They will be able to make internal calculations and connections that happen swiftly, that per Clarke's third law of science fiction, they appear like magic. This is a mental science, but as it is so highly developed, it looks like magic to normies. This will lead to rapid decision-making powers developed by decades of research, an unflappable exterior rooted in a sense of disassociation of the ego born of decades of online life, highly abstract thinking rooted in theory, pragmatic thinking rooted in the desire to find results. By primarily rooting one's experience of reality through the mental in either its rational or intuitive form, one is able to relate to the physical world in a more direct and unmediated way without getting bogged down in the intricacies of material life. For example, the whole host of material pleasures that the world offers will have little attraction to this new man. He will see things differently, scientifically, and without his ego being directly immersed in the decision-making process. The short-term pleasure of alcohol, drugs, and sex will be seen as moral hazards that have steep prices to pay in the long term. A sort of asceticism will be born out of physical sensory deprivation, which is what you have when you're terminally online, with a highly developed mental power, the result of decades of relating to the digital world. This class will be simultaneously have a future and past orientation at the expense of the present. The internet is an inherently future-oriented project based on a continued technological development, and individuals immersed in this medium cannot help embrace this mindset. This represents the non-neutrality of technology, for as a precondition to the use of the thing, the user must assume certain things about the thing. For example, a future orientation with regards to the internet. Yet at the same time, what protects these individuals from anomie is the drive for something more, a sense of rootedness in reality that can only be found in the past. This drive to the past to find stable ground will cultivate a past orientation as well. This will feed into the future orientation, as the best guide for human behavior is past human behavior. This is contrasted with modernity, which seeks to inculcate a presentist mindset to maximize consumer preferences. This new class will arise from unexpected quarters. The internet is inherently democratic in that it levels things. An online peon can at the CEO of General Motors on X. Currently existing class structures in the US, which are all rooted in physical capital and wealth, will be rendered meaningless, as even the poorest person can access the digital library of Alexandria. The question is, can that person avoid the moral hazards of hyperreality? With the ubiquity of smart devices, the internet and information wealth is no longer an effective gatekeeping mechanism. This new class and its origins will have the potential to span all the existing classes. One other aspect of how the internet provides the material conditions for a new class is the use of AI tools, specifically Grok and ChatGPT. As stated before, gatekeeping was the main way that entrenched professionals, the privileged classes, and the older generations sabotaged the younger generations. There is a whole galaxy of procedural knowledge on how the system works that everybody is just not going to tell you, even if you ask them point blank. Or if they do answer your question, it is some useless, personalized vignette that means nothing to anyone but the speaker. This is all different if you ask Grok, for example, how to meet compliance standards and fill out paperwork for your business with the appropriate authorities in your locale. It will tell you. The gatekeeping walls are crumbling like Jericho's walls under the army of Israel's trumpets. This empire of criminal stupidity is falling to dust. Furthermore, it turns out, no surprise to anyone, that machines and digital procedures make better machines and digital procedures than people. Through a combination of automation and AI tool proliferation, the procedural and technical work that used to be done by engineers, programmers, and technicians will be almost entirely done by machines and AI algorithms, with only a handful of humans monitoring and maintaining them. This will shift the economy towards what I call the creatives. People who are philosophical, poetic, artistic, and visionary. That is, people who can produce goods and services that machines cannot, as machines lack qualia. Engineers thought they were indispensable, but in reality, they were just inferior machines who designed their own replacements. While many decry the maldistribution of wealth, currently, it must be remembered that nobody is going to die of exposure or starvation in the United States in most cases. This means that the terminally online, even if financially struggling, are the poor in an age of superabundance. The superabundance allows the future elements of this new class to devote much of their life to online activities, and if they can avoid the moral hazards of hyperreality, ascend to the level of adept. Automation coupled with AI tools, coupled with these forces working in tandem to destroy all barriers to entry based on knowledge, an age of creative explosion is possible. These people, which I call the creatives, will be liberated from the drudgery of the kind of work they were stuck in before, such as food service or construction. By being able to use AI tools that have no vested interest in lying to you or gatekeeping, they will be able to navigate the web to start businesses and flourish, a digital renaissance. After discussing the conditions at work that will create the selection pressures for a new class, I will wrap this discussion up with a description of this new aristocrat in a somewhat idealized form. By idealized, I mean someone who is not merely the product of selection pressures, but intentional discipline and education. As we are entering into a mental economy where the cost of capitalization is your own education and the capital lies between your ears, the ability to observe, reason, hypothesize, and form conclusions on which to act will be essential. While a stylized character, Sherlock Holmes from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, embodied an idealized form of the mentalist. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of the real world and the objects that fill it. He uses this knowledge to relate objects to each other in order to form hypotheses, which he then tests. The Sherlock Holmes archetype embodies a keen scientific mind, marrying observation with theorizing and testing on the one hand, and a logical mind able to reason both forwards from a proposition to a conclusion and backwards from an observed fact to its cause. He runs circles around Scotland Yard and makes them look silly. Of course, Holmes is a good man that does not undermine the order of society, unlike his double Moriarty. Using the analytical reasoning of Sherlock Holmes, we can conclude that such a mind was the result of intentional construction on at least Holmes' part, if not a broader educational program, though that is unlikely as Holmes has few peers. Let us ask ourselves, what if such an educational system were produced intentionally for a large group of people? Admittedly, it would be elite. Most people would not have the mental acuity to pass it. Yet, if such an educational system were constructed to produce men with the mental powers of Sherlock Holmes, clearly such a graduating class would be unstoppable. No problem or obstacle would be insoluble or intractable. If we take this thought experiment further and go into my speculations on a mental or spiritual science, whereby mental powers are developed, speculated in Isaac Asimov's Second Foundation, we see an even greater power potential than just mastery of abstract knowledge, which is in itself immense. As I have stated elsewhere, if we define telekinesis as moving an object with your mind, we do this every day. We do this when we think to drink a cup of coffee, and then our body reacts to our mental instruction and we drink a cup of coffee. I argue that this is natural to man as is part of his natural constituency to do so. And to speculate that he might be able to do so with objects external to himself is conceivable. We might be at the stage where a medieval monk imagined powered flight, but even if it takes centuries, it is the imagination that is necessary. This I call the spiritual science, and coupled with Clarke's third law, we can just call this magic. I mean, from the POV of the reader in Scotland Yard, Sherlock Holmes does seem like a magician. To unpack things further, what I envision is something truly revolutionary: the scientific production of spiritual adepts through hermetic principles. In the past, saints, sages, and yogis might have manifested in their own lives the powers associated with true alignment with the divine through a lifelong commitment to self-denial and the practice of spiritual disciplines. This process was done in an unscientific way and done on a case-by-case basis. Often this was done on the outskirts of civilization because it was frowned upon. Contrary to the individualistic opinions of modern life, we know, regardless of individual circumstances, what is proper physical and mental well-being for an individual and the methods to achieve it, regardless of individual cases. This new class would craft a holistic system of education, physical as well as mental, economics, urban planning, and socialization that mutually reinforces the general tendencies and purposes of a holistic development of spiritually adapted men and women. To state in the simplest terms, rather than letting the production of saints, sages, and yogis being haphazard and case by case, the goal is to produce a socially constructed environment in which the obstacles to the realization of this new level of consciousness is removed and proper environmental pressures are created to shape people in this direction in a scientific and rational way. To summarize today's presentation, we have already seen the rise of three ruling classes: the aristocracy of the post-Western Roman Empire, the bourgeoisie, and the technocrats, all born out of a unique set of material conditions. The material conditions of superabundance, digital technology, and the rise of mental capital will form the selection pressures for a new class of mental aristocrats who will, in time, replace the bourgeoisie and technocrats. This new environment will itself be perilous, with many not surviving the moral hazards of hyperreality. Those that do survive will likely either be individuals gifted with great powers of reason and or intuition. These individuals will relate to the world primarily through mental and spiritual forces rather than physical or sensory. They will be ascetics, problem solvers, visionaries, and individuals with a great measure of control over their ego. This is a nuclei of a class developing under unplanned selection pressures. Once enough of these people develop and start forming intentional selection pressures of education, economic arrangement, and socialization, they will produce an individual idealized type of a hyper-rational problem solver along with an intuitive and imaginative genius. They will construct a social order that is rooted in understanding of the physical sciences as well as the emerging spiritual science and produce spiritual adepts in a controlled and scientific fashion. Once we move from unplanned to planned production of members of this class, no currently existing order can stand against them. Or to quote Carlyle, quote, "We figure society is a machine. And that mind is opposed to mind as body is to body, whereby 2 or at most 10 little minds must be stronger than one great mind. Notable absurdity. For the plain truth, very plain, we think, is that minds are opposed to minds in quite a different way. And one man that has a higher wisdom, a heretofore unknown spiritual truth in him, is stronger not than 10 men that have it not, or than 10,000, but than all men that have it not, and stands among them with quite ethereal angelic power, as with a sword out of heaven's own armory, sky-tempered, which no buckler and no tower of brass will finally withstand. Close quote. All right. Let's see the chat. Rick Verger, hello. GF, hello. And DeWitt Martins, hello. Let's see. All right, everyone. Make sure to tune in Thursday, where I will be joined once again by Florian to discuss an ID presentation put together by David Berlinski. So this is Ty Lewis to the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.